June 6, 1944. Normandy. While low clouds still covered the English Channel, the German High Command slept peacefully. General Alfred Jodl, in Berlin, had ended the previous night with the certainty that bad weather would ward off any attempt at invasion. No force, he said, would be able to cross the Channel in that climate. This belief, held by meteorologists, intelligence reports, and a blind reliance on doctrine itself, was about to be crushed by reality. Before sunrise, a German naval officer, Zuri Walter Olmsen, looked through the rangefinder of his coastal battery and saw the impossible. The sea had disappeared. In place of water, a continuous line of steel was advancing, more than 7,000 Allied ships in formation. What he saw that morning was not just a fleet, it was the physical manifestation of an industrial power that the Nazi regime said did not exist. In this video, the narrative will be conducted from the point of view of those on the German side. The goal is simple: to understand how an officer, looking at the horizon, understood in seconds what Hitler would take months to admit. That morning would not mark the beginning of the battle, it would mark the end of doubt. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any other. In less than 24 hours, the Allies landed 156,000 troops in Normandy, with the support of 7,000 ships, 20,000 vehicles, and more than 14,000 air sorties. Before the first shot was exchanged on solid ground, naval artillery had already dropped 130,000 tons of explosives on German coastal defenses. This was not a battle between armies. It was a collision between doctrine and production. Germany believed it was prepared to fight an invasion, but there was no way to contain an equation made of steel, oil, and endless logistics. And when Officer Olmsen raised his binoculars that morning, he saw no soldiers. He saw factories floating. If you value history and research based on real sources, please leave your like, subscribe, and share this video. This helps us continue to reveal the industrial and human backstage behind the greatest moments in military history. German arrogance before D-Day wasn't just strategic, it was mathematical. By June 1944, the German command was convinced that any attempted invasion of France would depend on two pillars: air superiority and port dominance. Neither, they believed, was within reach of the Allies. Weather reports indicated bad weather in the English Channel, and with that, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, believing that nothing would happen for days. In his post in Normandy, General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff of Army Group B, also ignored any non-standard movement. The OKW itself, the high command of the German armed forces, had reaffirmed a few days earlier that the real invasion was still far away. For them, everything was a game of time, and the enemy was too slow to react to the weather, logistics, and the natural wear and tear of war. But the mistake wasn't on the radars. It was in the mind. Germany engineered the war from its own scarcity, counted ammunition, rationed fuel, production under bombardment, and a collapsing workforce. They could not imagine an enemy that produced tanks like those who produced tractors, or airplanes like those who assembled automobiles. And it was precisely this limitation of imagination that condemned them. By 1944, the United States was producing about 650,000 military trucks a year, while Germany was barely 88,000. An army on wheels against an army with horses still pulling artillery pieces. The difference was brutal and invisible to the eyes of those who believed that they would win only by doctrine. If this statistic surprised you, comment below. Logistics wins. Because that's exactly what happened. German doctrine was still shaped by a romantic view of warfare, rapid, based on armored movements, encirclement tactics, and small-scale tactical superiority. The ghost of 1940 still hung over the Nazi generals. The conquest of France in 6 weeks, made with 135 divisions and the help of a cohesive command, had become the mental model for all defensive planning. But 4 years later, the context was different. The Luftwaffe was exhausted with only 300 operational aircraft in all of France. Synthetic fuel reserves were at their limit. Railway lines were daily targets for Allied bombers. And the German war industry, now overseen by Albert Speer, was struggling with its own logistical collapse. Still, the command insisted on comparing the Allies of 1944 with those of 1940, ignoring that the United States had become, in the interval, the greatest industrial power in human history. War for Washington was a matter of production planning, and every ship, plane, tank or spare part followed a logic that Germany could never replicate. The most symbolic mistake was the undersizing of the possible invading force. The German estimate, according to OKW documents, was that the Allies could launch a maximum of 20 divisions, with the support of 3,000 ships. The invasion of Normandy would arrive with more than twice as many vessels, with triple the attack force, and a level of coordination that defied all assumptions. Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception that kept the Germans convinced that the real invasion would come through Calais, completed the illusion. For weeks, inflatable tanks, fake radio transmissions, and manipulated documents created a perfect smokescreen, and when reality emerged, it was too late. Zuri Walter Olmsen, looking through the lens of his rangefinder that morning, saw no tactical divisions or coordinated battalions. He saw a productive force, something his doctrine never taught him to combat. Germany's warlike logic was that of surgical strike, precision engineering, elite effort. That of the Allies was that of redundancy. For each plane, there were spare parts. For every tank lost, there were 3 ready. For every logistical error, there was extra supply. The German mistake was not one of courage or strategy. It was of scale. They were prepared to fight soldiers, not spreadsheets. And with each new report that arrived at the command stations throughout the morning, what once seemed like an isolated operation turned out to be an irreversible offensive. The time for small victories was over, and in the next few minutes, the first shot would be fired, not by soldiers hiding in the dunes, but by an American battleship miles offshore, guided by radar, operated by a fueled, trained, and, above all, replaceable crew. But the first German reaction was yet to come. Confused, swift, but determined, and it will be from there that the sound of the cannons will open the scene where the war of the factories would begin to reveal itself. First light on June 6, 1944, had not yet broken through the sky over Normandy when Oberleutnant Zuri Walter Olmsen took up his observation post on Crisbeck's coastal battery. The sea fog was thick. The air carried the salty, static smell of a past storm, and the silence was too deep for a front line. He adjusted the long-range Zeiss binoculars by slowly moving them from left to right. In the beginning, there were only shadows, but little by little the fog subsided, and then the sea disappeared. Where there should be water, there was mass, continuous, uninterrupted, dense. A corridor of steel stretched from east to west, from the horizon to the coast. Every point a vessel, every silhouette a concrete threat. At that moment, the sea was no longer a natural obstacle. It was a walkway. Olmsen did not see a fleet. He saw an assembly line coming towards him. The rangefinder confirmed the distance. They were within range. He called the campaign phone and reported. On the other end of the line, silence. Not even the radio operators knew how to interpret what they were hearing. Then came the chants, Beobachtung bestätigen, bestätigen Sie das Ziel. Confirm observation, confirm target. But there was no target. There was everyone. There was everything. The Kriegsmarine reports did not foresee this. Intelligence had warned of possible sectorized landings, perhaps a limited operation, perhaps an attempt at diversion, never a continuous line of almost 7,000 ships. And yet she was there. Cruisers, destroyers, transport ships, dragamines, landing barges, support vessels, freighters, and what appeared to be floating pontoons. Naval engineering that did not even exist in the German operational lexicon. To Olmsen, who had spent 3 years inspecting French ships requisitioned for the Kriegsmarine, every hull was an affront. They were well painted, stocked, with visible flags, and advancing in formation. No hesitation, no pause, no sign of disorganization. Each vessel seemed to know exactly where to go, as if the whole operation had been rehearsed in silence for months. And there was something even more disturbing. Many of the ships were not even armed. They were adapted civilian ships, merchant ships piloted by Allied sailors from 8 countries. There were Canadian, British, American, Norwegian, Polish, French, and even Dutch boats. The logistics of such a diverse coalition had never crossed the mind of an officer trained in the rigidity of Wilhelmshaven, but now it sailed before his eyes. The doctrine of isolation, so dear to German strategic thinking, collapsed in seconds. The approaching force was not homogeneous. It was coordinated. Zuri Walter Olmsen put down his binoculars, looked at the shore, and then back out to sea. His trench didn't mean anything anymore. The anti-tank obstacles that had been planted in the sand were positioned to contain small landings, not to support dozens of divisions. The mines were poorly distributed. The concrete pillboxes, effective against an incursion, would be fixed targets for the bombardment that was sure to come. The Atlantic Wall was an illusion, built to intimidate, but never put to the test against what was now advancing. At 5:20 a.m., he was ordered to hold position and await confirmation of attack. The tension in the communication cables was physical. Every German unit along the coast began to report the same thing. Ships everywhere. From Cherbourg to Le Havre, the same image. At some points, observers began to count boats. Hundreds. Then they gave up. It was impossible to distinguish one from the other. The columns were compact but flowed with precision. Some boats were so shallow that they sailed as if they were part of the beach. Others, huge, advanced calmly, protected by the smaller boats. It was a choreography. A German engineer on the Longue-sur-Mer battery noted in his field notebook, "It is not a fleet, it's a production line over the sea." That sentence was never published, but it survived in the archives. It sums up what the German gaze was still trying to understand. It wasn't just numerical superiority. It was another doctrine, another kind of war. A war that began long before the battlefield, in the factories, on the tracks, in the ports, in the warehouses. The front had moved to the industrial rear, and now that rear guard was advancing, with hatches open, toward the beach. At 05:52 a.m., the first shots came from the warships. The sky had not yet cleared completely when the USS Texas and USS Nevada began the bombardment. But that's what we'll see in the next part. The moment when American artillery turned German concrete to dust and started the war of the factories. At 5:52 a.m., the order finally arrived. Feuer frei, open fire. Crispeck's coastal battery, commanded by Oberleutnant Zuri Walter Olmsen, began its first firing on the oncoming armada. The Czech 210mm guns, inherited from the arsenal of the former Czechoslovakia, were fired with precision. It was quality artillery, manned by experienced operators. In another context, they would be decisive pieces. But at that moment, against that mass, it was drops against an ocean. Each shot took tens of seconds to load, aim, and fire. The cadence was slow. The range is limited. And the ammunition, rationed for weeks, needed to be used carefully. Even so, the orders were clear. Shoot to kill. The first shells fell between the rows of ships. A close hit caused one destroyer to maneuver. Another burst amid the columns of smoke surrounding the battleships. A few minutes later, at 05:55 a.m., a salvo hit the USS Corey. The American destroyer suffered critical damage, lost power, and was abandoned by the crew before sinking. It was indeed a feat, the first and only American destroyer lost during D-Day. Because for every ship hit, there were 100 advancing. The supply line was as long as the horizon, and the targets kept coming. Olmsen's rangefinder couldn't keep up with the flow. In German tactical logic, the destruction of the USS Corey should be a sign of resistance, perhaps even deterrence. But in American logic, it was just one more among thousands of operational assets. The Corey sank, but caused no delay. He did not interrupt the disembarkation. Nothing has changed. His loss was recorded. It is immediately absorbed. What the Germans saw as a one-off victory was, for the Allies, a foreseen risk. Deliberate. Replaceable. Crispeck's artillery continued firing until 06:30. After that, the cadence decreased. Ammunition reserves were almost exhausted. Some guns had overheated. The operators exchanged silent glances. There was no sign of retreat on the part of the invading fleet. On the contrary, the columns were closer, faster, denser. What seemed like a distant line was now a moving wall, a wall of steel and smoke getting closer every minute. American warships began to respond. And what followed was the transformation of the sea into a floating artillery platform. The battleship USS Nevada, a survivor of Pearl Harbor, fired 14-inch salvos with millimeter accuracy, guided by forward observers. Each projectile weighed more than 600 kilos. Each impact produced craters of smoke and debris. Alongside it, the USS Texas and USS Arkansas completed the formation of fire. But the key to the American strategy was audacity. Several destroyers, such as the USS McCook, USS Carmack, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt, broke through the safety line and advanced to within 1,000 yards of the beach to fire on the German positions at point-blank range. It was an unthinkable move within German doctrine. Risk an entire ship to eliminate a point of resistance on land. But that was the logic. The asset was time, and every minute gained in the infantry advance was worth more than the steel hull. Crispek's coastal artillery suffered critical damage at 0710. One of the main pieces was rendered useless. Several operators were dead or injured. Olmsen continued to report positions, but now he used binoculars and a hand map. The rangefinder had been displaced by the impact of a nearby explosion. From that moment on, the battery operated by instinct and memory. At 07:30 a.m., German firing ceased completely. The heat, destruction, and displacement of air had destabilized the bases. Without communication with neighboring units, the garrison went into defensive mode. The only remaining option was to resist what was to come. But what was to come was not an attack. It was a system replacement. The static resistance system, the fixed fire system, the territorial defense system, all were about to be swallowed up by a moving and constant flow of force, supplies, and machinery. What the Germans faced was not an army in the classical sense. It was a treadmill, a walking assembly line that brought troops, tanks, fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment without pause. There was no way to break this chain. For every ship destroyed, there was another in its place. At each interrupted disembarkation point, another appeared a few meters away. Resistance was no longer a matter of strategy. It was a matter of time. And time, in that scenario, was something that Germany no longer had. But the German reaction was not over. There were still fortresses, high points, machine gun nests, and divisions positioned to contain the landings. And it will be on this unstable terrain, amid the fog and sand, that the next chapter will unfold, when the sky begins to roar and the air war turns the French coastline into a flying artillery laboratory. At 6 a.m., the French coastline began to shake under a new form of war. It was no longer the coastal cannons that dictated the pace. Now it was the sea. Not the sea as a natural barrier, but as a base of mobile fire. The USS Texas, positioned about 10 nautical miles offshore, began a saturation bombardment. In just 1 hour, it fired 255 14-inch shells, the equivalent of 178 tons of high-yield explosives. Each shot weighed almost 640 kilograms, traveling at more than 800 meters per second, with a margin of error of less than 10 meters when corrected by advanced observers. And Texas was not alone. To his right, the battleship USS Nevada repeated the cadence. To its left, the USS Arkansas was pouring fire on German batteries further west. In all, 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, and more than 60 destroyers made up the direct naval artillery group. But what impressed the German defenders was not only the volume, it was boldness. At about 07:45 a.m., several American destroyers advanced within 1,000 meters of the beach. The USS McCook, the USS Frankfurt, the USS Doyle, all maneuvering in shallow water, ignoring the risk of mines, strandings, and counterattacks. The goal was simple: to silence the German machine gun nests with 127-meter rounds at point-blank range. In doctrinal terms, that was irrational. Risking entire vessels to eliminate fixed positions was not common practice in traditional navies. But the United States could afford that. They had too many ships. They had spare parts. And above all, they had planning for losses. If one ship was damaged, there would be another in its role. The war, on the American side, had already ceased to be an exercise in scarcity. It was now an expression of abundance. At German observation posts, reports became chaotic. At Longues-sur-Mer, the coastal battery reported the destruction of its communication systems in less than 15 minutes. At Pointe du Hoc, the gunners were barely able to locate the targets before they were fired upon with millimeter accuracy. The projectiles fired by the American ships were guided by coordinates provided by reconnaissance planes and ground operators, part of an integrated system of coordinated fire, very rare in 1944. While German doctrine was still based on direct radio, visual, or cable communication, the Americans operated with a networked system. Each ship knew where to shoot, how much to shoot, and when to cease fire. It was a choreography of destruction. In one of the reports of the German 352nd Infantry Army, a commander recorded, "We were trained to repel landings, but when the shooting started, It felt like we were being shot at by an invisible, omnipresent, relentless force. The Atlantic Wall, built for years as a symbol of deterrence, collapsed not by land invasion, but by structural disintegration. The reinforced pillboxes could not withstand the direct impact of a naval salvo. In several sectors, the shells pierced reinforced concrete and exploded inside, causing multiple casualties in seconds. Strategically placed positions were obliterated before they could fire a single shot. This logic of preemptive annihilation was made possible by a factor that the Germans did not take into account: industrial mathematics. Each gun on Allied ships operated as a production unit, with a constant cadence, stockpile, and supply. The logic of the war had been reversed. Germany, accustomed to maneuvering with tactical precision, now faced the raw power of repetition. For every bunker, there was a dam. For each resistance point, a saturation statistic. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. For years, German officials have despised American mass production as a symbol of strategic mediocrity. They called it a war of numbers. They ignored that numbers' well-organized win. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more detailed content like this. Throughout the morning, German broadcasts slowed down. Many cables had been cut by shelling. The radio towers were out of operation. Several units had lost their senior officers, but the ships kept firing. The USS Texas, before retreating for refueling, had already expended more than 900 tons of ammunition, and the Normandy coast, in several sections, was already a continuous crater of debris. This was the first lesson of the industrial war. Steel, when manufactured on a large scale, becomes more strategic than courage itself. But naval power was only the opening. The sky, now clear, was about to reveal the second wave of the offensive. Thousands of planes flying in formation, paving the way for an unprecedented ground invasion. And what would come from above would change not only the course of the battle, but the concept of war itself. The naval bombardment had silenced the first lines of resistance. But as the skies began to darken with the metallic shadow of thousands of Allied aircraft, the German defenders understood that they were not just losing a battle, they were cut off from reality itself. At 06:30 a.m., the first medium bomber groups emerged in formation, followed by fighter bombers and reconnaissance squadrons. It was a choreography of aerial precision never seen before in combat. On D-Day, the Allies flew 14,674 air sorties, each with a specific purpose: destroying bridges, interdicting roads, bombing enemy concentrations, and above all, providing direct support to ground troops. The Luftwaffe, for its part, managed to execute only 319 sorties across French territory that same day. The difference was more than overwhelming. It was symbolic. The heavens belonged to the enemy. In a gesture of near desperation, Major Joseph Priller, one of the few aces still operational, took off with his Focke-Wulf 190 alongside his wingman, Heinz Wodarczyk, for a solitary mission. Sweeping Sword Beach with machine gun fire, the two planes carried out the only documented German air raid directly over the landing zones that morning. No German bombers appeared. No squadron arrived to protect the ground positions. No air support was felt by the defenders. Priller's action, later mythologized for its boldness, served as a bitter symbol of reality. The Luftwaffe no longer existed as a viable tactical force on the Western Front. In several reports of German soldiers, the feeling described was one of total abandonment. As Allied planes streaked across the sky in groups of dozens, forming seemingly endless rows, German radios remained silent. The anti-aircraft batteries, when they tried to react, gave away their position and were immediately obliterated by coordinated bombardment. Allied air superiority wasn't just quantitative, it was functional. The planes operated in shifts, by sectors, with radar coverage and full logistical support. For each Allied air mission there was guaranteed fuel, spare parts, evacuation routes, and contingency plans. The Luftwaffe, worn out by years of war, faced a cruel dilemma. Even the available planes could not operate regularly. There was a lack of experienced drivers, a lack of new engines, a lack of tires. In 1944, Germany was still producing aircraft, but not at a pace sufficient to replace losses or to maintain local air supremacy. An internal report of the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe in May of that year indicated that only 30% of the aircraft assigned to the Western Front were in operational condition. In the countryside, the reality was worse. Many units flew without radio. Others used recycled ammunition. Allied aviators, on the other hand, flew with state-of-the-art VHF radio, could communicate in real time with ground troops, ships, and headquarters. The result was surgical coordination. P-47, Thunderbolt, and Typhoon planes, armed with rockets and 500-pound bombs, carried out constant patrols behind enemy lines. It was enough for a German column to try to move by road to be intercepted in less than 10 minutes. The concept of attack of opportunity has become daily doctrine. The psychological impact was devastating. A soldier from the 21st Panzer Division reported, "We could hear the engines before we saw them. And when we saw them, it was too late. It was as if heaven hated us." Another officer from the anti-tank artillery wrote in his letter, "It wasn't just the fear of the bombs. It was silence on our side. The radio said nothing. No hope, no reinforcement, no answer." Air supremacy also meant dominance over information. The Allies possessed photographic reconnaissance planes that accurately documented enemy movements. The images obtained throughout the 6th were used in the first 24 hours to adjust bombardments, redesign landing zones, and reorganize logistical flows. The Germans, in turn, operated blindly. With no access to the air, no control over routes, and no possibility of regrouping, their units became scattered targets in the open. More than that, the dominance of the skies prevented the effective use of German mobile strategy. The panzer divisions, traditionally fast and lethal, became prisoners of the terrain. Moving an armored battalion in daylight was almost suicide. Allied fighter bombers, guided by observers on the ground, could destroy individual vehicles with precision. In just one morning, hundreds of supply trucks were destroyed. In the following days, this logistical destruction would make any coordinated counteroffensive impossible. It was systemic collapse. Germany had not lost the will to fight. It had lost the right to fight with the same tools. And not because of cowardice or betrayal, but because of a lack of structure. There was a lack of kerosene, rubber, copper. There was a lack of communication and coordination. And above all, the sky was missing. By the end of D-Day, the account was closed. For every German plane that flew, 46 Allied aircraft crossed French airspace. The Americans and British didn't just dominate space. They turned it into a weapon of total denial. But even in the face of absolute air superiority, the real watershed was yet to come. What would come next would not be a wave of soldiers, but a continuous wake of supplies, vehicles, tanks, and pontoon bridges. It was war turned into an assembly line, and the ground of France would soon feel its weight. As the smoke from naval bombing began to dissipate and the skies remained completely under Allied rule, German observers turned their attention to the sea, and it was then that they witnessed something that no Wehrmacht war manual had ever prepared to explain. It wasn't just a fleet. It was a floating assembly line, an uninterrupted flow of vehicles and logistics solutions embodied in steel, rubber, and oil. At 7 a.m., the first LCTs, landing craft tank, began dropping Sherman tanks directly onto the beaches. The 30-ton machines were not hoisted or pushed. They simply drove away as if they were delivered by a factory winch. Right behind, the LSTs, landing ship tank, 328-foot giants, literally ran aground on purpose on the coast, opened their steel mouths, and dumped entire convoys of armored vehicles, trucks, jeeps, and artillery pieces, as if unloading supply boxes into a warehouse. Every action, every piece, every ship, seemed part of a modular system designed not by generals but by industrial engineers. The psychological impact was immediate. German soldiers, accustomed to months of shortages, watched in disbelief as amphibious tanks swam ashore and then sped directly toward enemy positions. The DKWs, six-wheeled floating hull amphibious trucks, crossed the waves as if the sea were a poorly paved road. They came out of the water, climbed the sand, crossed the first slopes, and delivered ammunition, fuel, and supplies directly into the hands of the troops in combat. It was real-time logistics, a feat that the German army could never achieve even on paper. German doctrine still functioned on the basis of sacrifice, supply by animal traction, tactical improvisation, and extreme use of human resources. The Americans, on the other hand, were operating with a completely different philosophy: to solve with screws what the enemy solved with blood. For each problem on the front, there was a specific vehicle, an accessory, a mobile structure. Ramps, temporary bridges, communication vehicles, and armored support vehicles appeared in the exact sequence as if they had been designed for a war board. And in fact, they had been. Colonel Paul Thompson, Chief Landing Engineer for the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, later described it. Each beach was a logistical point. Each ship was a warehouse. Each truck was a timed delivery. The efficiency was such that some artillery units received new ammunition even before they had exhausted the first loadouts. German astonishment at these solutions was recorded in several later accounts. An officer of the 352nd Infantry Division stationed near Omaha Beach wrote, "We have seen the sea become a road, the ships become warehouses, and the tanks emerge from the foam like monsters that could swim. The constant presence of DUKWs, ironically nicknamed fish trucks by the Germans, symbolized this paradigm shift. What the Germans called field improvisation, the Americans called prefabrication. What Germany saw as a logistical obstacle, the Allies treated as an engineering variable, and this became evident in every minute that passed. By noon, the trains were still flowing, and contrary to what the German High Command predicted, the Allies did not need ports. They were creating their own. Floating platforms, mobile ramps, improvised cranes on LSTs, everything was already part of the plan. Each landing was an exercise in logistical design, not a leap in the dark. And this demoralized the German resistance not only by brute force, but by intelligence of application. In German doctrine, improvisation was the norm. In Allied doctrine, it was eliminated before it began, replaced by redundant systems, spare parts, and contingency plans integrated into the DNA of operations. The difference between the forces was more than visible. It was structural. While the Wehrmacht counted ammunition on hand, the Americans had inventory systems that predicted hourly consumption. While German officers fought for a functional radio, the Americans operated mobile radar and real-time communication stations. Germany still calculated the war in courage, America in efficiency, and if the sight of those vehicles was already baffling, the revelation that would come in the coming days would be even more humiliating. The Allies didn't just plan to land, they planned to build ports from scratch. A plan that on paper bordered on science fiction for the German General Staff, but which would prove to be an absolute triumph of Western industrial engineering. The difference wasn't on the front, it was in the factories, hangars, shipyards, and design departments. And for those who still doubted the size of this technical abyss, the numbers spoke for themselves. American production of amphibious vehicles in 1944 exceeded by 20 times that of all occupied Europe. If you were surprised by this statistic, write in the comments, "Industrial War." The shock would not end there. Each American solution carried with it a subtext of technical provocation. You bleed, we screw. You pray for reinforcements, we deliver them by the ton. And as Sherman tanks took position on the slopes, and DUKWs made shuttle trips like punctual buses, a new invisible structure began to take shape beneath the waves. Because the Americans weren't just winning the war in the sand, they were about to do the impossible, build a port from nothing. And this would redefine late on June 6, 1944, as dusk shrouded the Norman countryside with a heavy, dense haze of smoke. What was left of the German forces understood, perhaps for the first time, the scale of what had happened. In just 24 hours, the Allies had landed 156,000 troops on French soil. Along with them came 1,700 tanks, 20,000 vehicles, and hundreds of pieces of field artillery, anti-aircraft, and logistics. This human, mechanical mass was not only numerically superior, it was systemically superior, and his pace of arrival exceeded the German ability to react. For comparison, the entire German 7th Army responsible for the defense of Normandy numbered barely 150,000 men, dispersed on a broad front, weakened by lack of transportation, cut off by the absence of air support, and demoralized by the loss of communication between divisions. With each Allied landing, the balance broke a little more. With each new vehicle unloaded on the sand, the German defensive structure gave way. The attempted response came from the 21st Panzer Division. Located south of Caen, it was considered one of the last armored reserves capable of reacting to an invasion. At 10:30 a.m., his orders arrived. Advance 10 miles to Sword Beach, hold off the landing, and establish a coordinated counterattack. 3 hours later, at 1:45 p.m., the division's vanguard had only covered half the way. The reason? Constant attacks by Allied aviation, barrages of naval fire, roads destroyed by bombardments, and ambushes by light infantry. Many tanks never arrived. Others were abandoned after being immobilized in craters. A British report from the 3rd Division described how Typhoon planes, guided by observers on the ground, destroyed 30 German vehicles in a single 20-minute mission. The German advance was not stopped. It was absorbed. Resistance on the ground was irregular. Some German units fought to the last cartridge, defending 50-meter stretches with desperate courage. But on an operational scale, it no longer mattered. Because for each point of resistance, there were 3 alternative routes. For every German soldier, there were 2 Americans arriving from the rear. For each attempt to regroup, a dive bomber. The defensive formations, which for years had been trained to fight on fixed fronts, found themselves crushed by a force that neither respected axes nor expected lines of combat. The Allied offensive was multidimensional, land, sea, and air acting simultaneously, with continuous flow and almost mathematical coordination. Colonel Hans von Luck, commander of the 21st Panzer, wrote years later, "We have been trained to fight armies. What landed in Normandy was something different. It was an operational entity with its own lungs, constant feeding and eyes in all directions." The description was not exaggerated. The Allied logistics system was so advanced that before sunset, the first mobile wards were already operating on the beaches. Medical vehicles circulated between sectors. The wounded were evacuated by specific speedboats, and the flow of ammunition functioned as an automated production line. There was no idle time. Every square meter of beach was used with purpose. In the German rear, frustration was growing. Communications with the front were unstable. The reports arrived incomplete. Several generals didn't even know what was happening to their divisions. General von Schweppenberg, commander of Panzergruppe West, had his headquarters destroyed by an aerial bombardment before issuing any strategic orders. The maps were outdated. The enemy lines had already changed places twice. It was the beginning of the functional tactical collapse. The war, as the Germans had conceived, had disappeared. In its place, an operation had emerged that replaced command with system. Improvisation was no longer an advantage, it was a risk. The line between initiative and disorientation had been broken. A sergeant of the 716th Infantry Division recorded in his diary, "We did not know where the enemy was, and at the same time, we knew he was everywhere." Pause for an indisputable fact. On D-Day, the United States placed on French soil more combat vehicles than Germany could produce in 2 entire months. The manufacturing ratio between the two powers in 1944 was already over the 10-to-1 mark. If you were surprised by this, write in the comments, "Logistics wins." And logistics didn't just win, it was advancing. By the end of the first day, the Allies had not only conquered the beaches, they had established bases, makeshift airfields, supply corridors, and integrated commands. They were installing a full army, piece by piece, and each new piece brought with it more pieces. The invasion was not an event, it was a continually expanding process. But to understand how far this process has been taken, it is necessary to look at what has begun to emerge beneath the waves. Because the Allies were about to unveil their most unthinkable move, the construction of an entire port, floating, mobile, and functional, in the middle of enemy territory. The name? Mulberry Port, and its existence would forever change the concept of modern invasion. In the days following the Normandy landings, as the Germans awaited a direct assault on the ports of Cherbourg or Le Havre, the Allies executed a maneuver that bordered on insanity, but it was, in fact, an unprecedented feat of engineering. Instead of fighting to conquer the heavily defended French ports, they decided to build them from scratch, in the middle of the sea, facing the still unstable coast of occupied France. The project was known by the name Mulberry, and what had seemed until then to be the theoretical idea of optimistic engineers became reality before the bewildered eyes of German intelligence. Within days, 2 artificial harbors began to emerge on Arromanches and Omaha beaches. They were not improvised piers. They were complete facilities with docks, breakwaters, landing areas, and floating roads. Each port was composed of 600,000 tons of precast concrete, towed in modules through the English Channel, and positioned with millimeter precision by crane ships. To protect these structures from the impact of the waves, the Allies deliberately sank 70 cargo ships forming a steel wall, called the Gooseberry, that broke the sea before it reached the floating modules. The sea roads, known as Whale, were true floating metal tracks up to 2 kilometers long, supported by structures called beetles, which adjusted to the tides. Over them, trucks, cranes, tractors, and jeeps transited continuously, as in a fixed port terminal. But this terminal floated, bent to ocean conditions, and continued to operate even in storms. At Arromanches, Port Mulberry B, codenamed Port Winston, achieved the capacity to unload 7,000 tons of supplies per day. And all this without a single original French structure being used. The Germans, when they saw the first aerial images, did not believe it. To them, it was inconceivable that an invading force would bypass port centers and create entirely new physical alternatives. An intercepted report from the German 84th Corps recorded, "They did not take the ports. They created them." More than a tactical innovation, Mulberry Port symbolized the total disruption of logistical dependence on pre-existing infrastructure. For the first time in modern military history, an expeditionary force was able to design, build, and operate its own logistics chain in hostile territory, without needing concessions from the environment. War, literally, ceased to depend on the terrain. The terrain began to be shaped by the war. The logistical details of the Mulberry project reveal the depth of Allied planning. The concrete modules, called Phoenix, were manufactured at 146 different sites across the United Kingdom, transported by tugs to the French coast, and sunk in predetermined positions based on tidal calculations and underwater topography. Each floating breakwater, called a bombardon, is designed to withstand waves of up to 4 meters and cushion the impact on cargo platforms. And the pontoon bridges were not fixed. They moved like hydraulic joints following the rise and fall of sea level. Engineering here was not a support of the war. It was the war itself. For the Germans, accustomed to defending cities, railways, stations, and ports, the concept of an enemy force that brought its own infrastructure completely subverted the fundamentals of territorial defense. No position was safe, because no position was needed. The Allies had made the coast itself irrelevant. One German general who was a prisoner summed up his bewilderment when questioned by the British. "We thought you would seek our ports. We never imagined that they could manufacture them." This was the nature of the new war. No longer the conquest of fixed structures, but the creation of mobile, scalable, and replaceable systems. If one port was destroyed, another could be started. If a bridge fell, a new one would be inflated and launched on the same day. The logic behind Mulberry was the same as that which guided the entire Overlord operation. Remove traditional dependencies and replace them with processes. Where once there was a struggle for supply, now supply was manufactured. Where once strategy revolved around fixed objectives, it now revolved around flows. The land is no longer an obstacle to become just a logistical vector. The invasion of Normandy at this point ceased to be a military maneuver. It became an experiment in applied engineering on a continental scale. The success of Mulberry ports was not only technical, it was conceptual. He proved that a force with total industrial control could create the ideal conditions for combat wherever it wanted. And this fact, more than any artillery or number of troops, signaled the inevitable victory of the West. In just 3 weeks, more than 500,000 tons of supplies passed through the Mulberries. This included ammunition, fuel, food, clothing, spare parts, and even material for airport construction. Beaches, once geographical landmarks, now functioned as dynamic logistics hubs. Control of the sea was no longer just naval, it was structural. And as Allied troops advanced into the French countryside, supplies followed like a continuous wake, fed not by luck or improvisation, but by spreadsheets, schedules, and cargo ships. Germany had built the Atlantic Wall. America, a mobile production line that ran through it. And if the port could be created, what else would this machine be able to manufacture? The answer would come soon, and it wouldn't just involve tanks or harbors. It would include complete airstrips assembled on French soil in less than 72 hours. Because the war was now not won by where you fought, but by who produced faster. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, German soldiers began to realize with brutal lucidity that they were not just fighting other soldiers, they were facing an entire production chain. War, once conceived as a duel of armies, was transformed before his eyes into a contest between industrial systems. As Wehrmacht divisions marched in ration supplies, scarce radios, and counted ammunition, each American regiment seemed to emerge from the ground with endless supplies, real-time coordination, and direct access to fire support. The asymmetry was total, not only in number but in nature. Each American platoon carried SCR-536 portable radios, enabling direct communication with the command and neighboring units. Forward observers marked enemy positions accurately, and within minutes field artillery fired calibrated shells over exact coordinates. The radio wasn't just a tool, it was a link between the levels of the operation. A lieutenant on the front line could, with one sentence, call for a bombardment, request medical evacuation, or request reinforcements. In contrast, German units relied on wire telephony, which was constantly broken by Allied advance, and on messengers exposed to enemy fire. German tactical coordination was, in practice, operating in an analog time, while the American Army acted in digital time. The material abundance became visible in every detail. American soldiers had spare boots, hot food, assorted ammunition, and individual medical kits. Their trenches were reinforced with sandbags supplied on an industrial scale. Their defensive positions had constant engineering support, while their attacks were preceded by barrages calculated in cadence and range. Each battalion seemed to move with the support of an invisible army. The army of the rear, the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of New Orleans, the training camps of Kansas. A captain of the 352nd Infantry Division, after being captured near St. Lo, reported his bewilderment. "They do not beat us by the strength of the arm, but by the strength of the system. They are no longer welded. They are extensions of a larger machine." That was it. The battlefield ceased to be a physical terrain and became an extension of industrial parks. Each shot fired by an M1 Garand rifle was the last link in a chain that began on an assembly line thousands of miles away. Each bombing raid was preceded by a strategic meeting supported by air intelligence, observational data, and serial production of ammunition. The Germans, on the other hand, without supplies, improvised grenades, reused belts, and kept MG-42 machine guns working with parts of dubious origin. The American presence in the field grew not only in number, but in technical density. Units such as combat engineers became protagonists. Instead of just destroying bridges, they built new ones in real time, with prefabricated kits. Vehicles such as the M3 half-tracks operated as hybrid platforms, transport, fire support, evacuation, all in one chassis. Sherman tanks with flamethrowers, command armored vehicles with long-range antennas, trucks with radio stations. Each vehicle seemed to carry not only weaponry, but embedded intelligence. This logic extended to the behavior of the troops. Trained in standardized centers and exposed to combat simulations before crossing the Atlantic, American units operated with standardized protocols and clear doctrines. Each company knew what to do in case of artillery fire, in case of failed advance, in case of need for evacuation. The manual replaced improvisation. Training replaced tradition. Repetition replaced isolated heroism. And that made all the difference. For the Germans, war was still, in practice, an art of adaptation. They reacted to each situation with courage and tactics, but with little predictability. The decentralized structure of its divisions, coupled with chronic scarcity, generated heroic but disconnected behaviors. Many units did not even know what was happening on the neighboring flank. In contrast, the U.S. military advanced as a single organism. When one battalion took a city, another moved to fortify it. When one platoon fell, another took its position with air support. The most glaring difference emerged when observing the use of artillery. While the Germans struggled to keep their howitzers supplied, often with ammunition of mixed or recycled calibers, the Americans operated with industrial precision. The time-on-target system, developed by the Allies, allowed several batteries to fire from different locations to simultaneously hit the same point, collapsing defenses in seconds. It was mathematics replacing chance, statistics replacing sentiment, the doctrine of the system replacing the doctrine of sacrifice. Pause for a technicality. In 1944, the United States produced more than 40,000 military vehicles per month, the equivalent of what Germany took 6 months to manufacture. If this number impressed you, write in the comments, "Shocking data," because that was the real war, a race between factories, between carriers, between engineers and planners. The front line was just the final showcase. The result of this asymmetry was inevitable. Germany fought with what it had, the United States with whatever they wanted, and this difference became irreversible. In the fields of Normandy, it was no longer a matter of bravery. It was a matter of replacement. The American enemy did not need to be replaced, it was resupplied. The ammunition was not spared, it was accounted for. The strategy was not adaptive, it was designed. Collapse, then, was not a matter of time. It was a matter of calculation. But even with all this apparatus, what would come next would raise the scale to a new level. For if the Americans could build ports, operate as factories, and fight as systems, the next question was inevitable. Could they fly direct from France with operational planes in less than 72 hours? The answer would come in airstrips that would emerge as mirages of steel and asphalt. As Sherman tanks advanced through the damp fields of Normandy and P-47 planes sliced through the sky like gleaming blades, the real collapse of the Third Reich didn't just occur on the flanks, on the bridges, or in the harbors. It happened within the mines. In the stuffy bunkers and mobile command posts, German officers confronted a truth that corroded more than any projectile. The ideology under which they were formed did not explain what they were seeing. The doctrine taught that the West was weak, that the average American was undisciplined, ill-prepared, inferior, morally and even biologically. But what they found on the battlefield were young men with calm faces who dexterously handled radios, administered first aid with surgical precision, and coordinated attacks with almost mechanical ease. They were troops composed of drivers, workers, students, farmers, civilians converted into combatants, and yet they fought like professionals. The actions of the Allied forces undermined the foundations of the Nazi myth. Propaganda insisted on the moral degeneration of the enemy, his dependence on comfort, and his aversion to sacrifice. But the beaches told another story. The first Allied echelons traversed minefields, swam under crossfire, and scaled steel obstacles while their comrades died alongside. They did not hesitate. Each platoon seemed to know its role. Each loss was immediately replaced with logistical precision. One American soldier fell, and another took his place with a map in his hand and a radio on his shoulder. The discrepancy between what German officers had been indoctrinated to believe and what they were witnessing caused internal rifts. Physical defeat is understandable in war, but ideological defeat, when one can no longer trust one's own reasoning, is devastating. Reports began to emerge of mental breakdowns in mid-range commanders, especially among those who had served on the Eastern Front. There they fought enemies who, although numerous, acted in a predictable way: movement, defense, retreat. But the Americans brought a new rhythm. They acted like an electric current, connecting units, repeating patterns, pressing without pause. It was a war without breath, and it was too organized to be attributed to chance. In post-war interviews, General Gunther Blumentritt described the astonishment caused by American behavior. They talked loudly, laughed between bombardments, wrote letters with the noise of howitzers passing overhead, and the next moment coordinated an offensive with the coolness of a surgeon. That composure, which the doctrine manuals called the immaturity of the Westerner, proved to be a brutal asset. It wasn't emotional coldness. It was training. It wasn't arrogance. It was efficiency. On the front, ideological erosion translated into silence. Many officers have stopped repeating the mantras of propaganda. The triumphalist speeches disappeared. The rhetoric about the invincible Germanic spirit was swallowed up by the realization that they were facing an entity that did not depend on mystique. It depended on engineering, calculation, control. And this enemy didn't come alone. It came packed in supply boxes with landing diagrams, field manuals, and a contingency plan. This clarity was disconcerting, because for years Nazi ideology was built on the idea of chaos for others. German was the salary, the American, the improvised. German was the product of discipline, the enemy of consumption. But now, in the middle of Normandy, the Germans improvised with confiscated bicycles and destroyed telephone lines, while the enemy set up mobile hangars and complete medical operations at the same pace as an assembly line. The final blow to internal morale came from the intelligence notebooks. Documents captured from American clipboards showed detailed maps of each French sector, alternate supply routes, troop rotation shifts, and even meal tables. This was not an army operating under necessity. It was an organism that had planned every detail even before touching French soil. German liaison officers who witnessed the inner workings of the Allies reported something even more disturbing. American military culture was horizontal. A sergeant had the autonomy to retreat, maneuver, make decisions. A lieutenant could disobey orders if he had a better view of the tactical situation. The doctrine of flexibility, which the Germans despised as a sign of weakness, was proving superior to the rigid Prussian hierarchy. While officers waited for orders from Berlin, the Americans were already 2 miles ahead, reconfiguring the battlefront without wasting time on protocol. This symbolic break reverberated in the morale of the prisoners. Interrogations showed confused German soldiers, some in shock, others simply disoriented. A major of the 716th Division, captured in the Juno sector, declared, "We didn't know you could do that. We didn't know you guys would do that." The "it" was everything. The invasion, the logistics, the mobilization, the impersonal force of the Allied machine. With the collapse of ideology came the beginning of resignation. There was no longer talk of victory. There was talk of containment, extra time, time gained. The goal was no longer to repel. It was to survive. The arrogance disappeared, and in its place came the bitter silence of someone who understood that he was fighting against an opponent he had already won at the moment he decided to fight. But there was still one last frontier to be crossed: the air. Because Americans didn't just control the sky, they used it as a supply bridge. And what would follow would be the emergence of something never seen in modern warfare: airstrips set up from scratch in less than 72 hours, so that fighters and bombers could operate directly from occupied France. And when the Germans heard the sound of engines taking off from their own territory, they knew that the ground beneath their feet no longer belonged to them. In the eyes of the Wehrmacht, the American army looked like an anomaly. New uniforms, standardized equipment, abundant supplies, everything packed, labeled, delivered, and running. But what the German generals did not understand was that behind every American division, there were not only soldiers, there were factories. The one that crossed the Atlantic was not an ordinary army. It was an industrial force disguised as a military force. The United States did not enter World War II only with political will. It entered with a production plan. A plan that would transform Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Los Angeles, and hundreds of medium-sized cities into nerve centers of the largest war supply chain ever created. Unlike the German war economy, which still relied on military bureaucracy and centralized decisions, the U.S. decentralized the war. The factories became barracks. CEOs became generals of production. And the goal wasn't just to win, it was to manufacture victory. The basis of everything was the concept of the arsenal of democracy, coined by Franklin D. Roosevelt. But that inspiring slogan soon became timelines, goals, contracts, and assembly lines. Ford Motor Company began producing B-24 bombers in series. A unit was ready every 63 minutes at Willow Run, a factory that operated 24 hours a day. General Motors produced more than 850,000 trucks. Chrysler, Sherman tanks. Packard manufactured airplane engines. Even companies that had never seen a gun, such as Singer, famous for sewing machines, were converted to produce rifles and helmets. The United States did not improvise its war machine. It standardized it, and that made them unstoppable. While Germany, mired in internal disputes between Himmler, Göring, and Speer, tried to balance production with ideology, the Americans entrusted the war to industrial engineers. Supply chain management was done as in a business system. There were monthly goals, productivity reports, quality standards, statistical controls. The Army did not order weapons. It placed orders with technical specifications, delivery times, and guarantees. The contracts were divided between primary, secondary, and complementary suppliers. If one link in the chain fell, another replaced it. It was the logic of the market applied to conflict, and it worked with mathematical precision. Pause for a technicality. Between 1940 and 1945, the U.S. produced 297,000 planes, while Germany produced about 119,000 in the same period. Almost 3 American planes for every German plane. If this number surprised you, comment below. Shocking data. Because superiority didn't come from miracles, it came from a disciplined assembly line, fueled by millions of civilian workers, each operating like a cog in a continental engine. This structure made the American military something unprecedented, an extension of the economy. The soldiers wore uniforms sewn by civilian garment factories, with standardized sizes and optimized distribution. K-feed, developed in the lab to provide nutrients with reduced weight, was packaged in millions of units by food companies such as Heinz and Kellogg's. The fuel was refined in record time by consortiums created specifically to feed the Allied fleet. Every element of the war, from the bullet to the bomber, was the product of a logistical decision. The power was not only on the front, it was in stock. This logic redefined the concept of military force. The infantry was not only composed of combatants, it was the final link in a chain that began with miners in Colorado, passed through steel mills in Ohio, factories in Kansas, railroad lines in New York, cargo ships in Norfolk, and ended on the beaches of Normandy. No other nation had achieved this level of integration between economics and war. Germany still depended on forced labor, the pillaging of occupied territories, the improvised conversion of civilian production. The U.S., on the other hand, generated a surplus. They produced for themselves and for their allies. They supported the USSR with trucks, the United Kingdom with ammunition, China with supplies, while still supplying their own war effort with leftovers. The consequence was visible on the field. German soldiers saw Allied vehicles with identical parts without improvised adaptations, vehicles that ran for weeks without breakdowns, standardized weapons that facilitated maintenance and training, planes with unified radio systems, bombs, and onboard weapons. In contrast, the Luftwaffe operated dozens of different models, each with quirks that required specific technicians, unique parts, and unique inventories. Complexity was a burden for the Germans. Standardization, a weapon for Americans. What was becoming evident was that the U.S. had made the war a logistical project. They did not depend on the genius of a commander, the luck of a battle, or the bravery of a regiment. They depended on tables, deadlines, and continuous supply. The Army functioned as an end customer, receiving combat kits ready to operate. It was a total inversion of the European paradigm, where the Army shaped the economy. Here it was the economy that shaped the Army. This change was so profound that it even influenced the way of thinking about wartime. For the Germans, the war was a collective sacrifice of blood, sweat, and improvisation. For the Americans, it was a large-scale operation, where winning depended on efficiency, management, and engineering. The campaign manuals reflected this. A 1943 U.S. Army manual instructed that each unit should forecast ammunition consumption per day, calculate equipment wear per week, and plan resupply routes per hour. It was a science applied to combat. The results of this system were cumulative. While the German effort decreased month by month due to lack of resources, the American effort accelerated. New factories were opened, new contracts signed, new methods tested. When a solution didn't work, it was replaced within weeks. The Army was a demanding customer, and industry responded with innovation. This is how amphibious tanks, long-range bombers, and accelerated production Liberty ships came about. Each tactical problem generated a technical response, and that answer came with manuals, spare parts, and pre-planned logistics. And by the time the soldiers of the Reich finally understood that they were facing not a nation, but an economic structure in motion, it was too late. Because this structure was unstoppable, scalable, adaptable. A German general wrote in his diary, "They do not beat us in battles, they win before battles." And what would come next would show that, even in the face of imminent victory, the American machine was still far from slowing down. Because the next stage would not be about production. It would be about occupation, reconstruction, and global projection. The numerical superiority of the Allies in Normandy was overwhelming, but it did not explain everything. What really tipped the scales wasn't just quantity, it was the fusion of scale and technology. In 1944, the American war machine was not only bigger, it was more precise, more adaptable, smarter. At dawn on D-Day, while German radars were still groping in the dark and their officers debating whether the invasion was real or a bluff, Allied ships navigated with surgical precision, guided by fire control radars that adjusted the guns in real time. It was a new era, where once a naval firing required manual calculation and visual correction, now a cruiser could hit a target 15 kilometers away with a first burst hit. And the results were visible. German bunkers were destroyed before their commanders could even respond. The time between detecting and neutralizing the enemy had been reduced to minutes, but the real watershed came from the skies and from science. The Allies had introduced proximity fuses, a technology that the Germans were not only unaware of, but did not even imagine was possible. Instead of detonating on impact, these projectiles exploded when they approached a target, multiplying their effectiveness against aircraft and infantry by up to 7 times. A German battalion that could previously protect itself from artillery with dispersion and cover now took a hit with precision even on the move. The trenches are no longer shelter. The natural cover, irrelevant. For every conventional grenade, one with a proximity fuse caused twice as many casualties. The irony of this was brutal. Germany, which had started the war with cutting-edge technology, panzer tanks, V-2 rockets, silent submarines, was now technologically behind. His rockets were too expensive to mass produce. Their tanks required constant maintenance. Their planes needed long runways and scarce fuel. The Allies, on the other hand, were moving in the opposite direction, producing more, with less complexity, and increasing efficiency. The technology was functional, modular, replicable, and perhaps the ultimate symbol of this was a clumsy-looking amphibious vehicle, the DUKW. Called Duck by soldiers, the DUKW was a 6-wheeled truck capable of riding on land and water. He had no armor. He had no weapons. But it solved one of the biggest bottlenecks of the war, the transport of supplies from the beach to the interior. With it, tanks of gasoline, ammunition, and food crossed stretches of sea, disembarked directly on the beaches, and continued along improvised roads. In just one day, the DUKWs transported more than 18,000 tons of cargo. This represented the equivalent of 90 full trains, and they did it without rails, without ports, without fixed structures. It was absolute mobility and unthinkable for the Germans, whose logistics still depended on vulnerable railroads and horses for artillery transport. Another factor that amplified the Allied advantage was the technological integration between units. American portable radios allowed communication between infantry, tanks, artillery, and aviation. A unit would advance and counter resistance, and within minutes could call for aerial bombardment or naval support with coordinated precision. Such vertical coordination was impossible for the Germans, whose communications still relied on land cables and messengers in many sectors. An isolated battalion remained isolated. For the Americans, each soldier was part of a network, and networks win wars. Pause for a technicality. While Germany produced about 50,000 portable tactical radios during the entire war, the United States manufactured more than 800,000 for infantry use alone, a difference of 16 to 1. If this number surprised you, comment below. Logistics wins. Because this statistic is not just a detail, it is the backbone of the campaign in Normandy. American technology did not seek to impress. It sought to work. And at this point, she was relentless. The equipment came with illustrated user manuals. Each piece had a serial number. The ammunition was color-coded for quick identification. The weapons, produced in series, could have parts exchanged with each other without adjustment. A wounded soldier could be replaced, and his successor would use the same rifle, the same helmet, the same ration. The war had become plug-and-play. For the Germans, this was an affront to military tradition, but it was also the reason for defeat. Because in the end, the Allied technology was not only in the field, she was in the process. In the sheds where supplies were stacked by code, on timed trains, on printed maps with weather data updated by satellite. It was an ecosystem, and each new innovation was integrated into the whole like a piece of an industrial puzzle. War was no longer about strategy, it was about system, and on this new battlefield, the United States was fighting like an automated machine. The German generals, upon reading the first reports on the DUKWs, on the proximity fuses on the artillery radars, reacted with incredulity, not because they thought it was impossible, but because they never considered that a Western, consumerist, liberal nation could apply its technology with such discipline. They expected weakness where they found efficiency. They expected chaos where there was engineering. But there was more to come. Because behind the scenes of Operation Overlord, a new war front was taking shape. The underwater pipelines known as Operation Pluto, which would take fuel from England directly to France without depending on tankers. And when the Germans knew that even the energy that powered the tanks was already being pumped under the sea, they would realize that the invasion was only the surface of what was behind. The war was already lost, but engineering had not yet finished its work. For the German soldiers who survived the first impact of the invasion, there was an image that none of them would forget. It was not the roar of the bombers, nor the metallic roar of the tanks descending through the hills of Normandy. It was the cold, mechanical silence of a bulldozer pushing what was left of a destroyed M4 Sherman tank off the road. The tank, still steaming from a direct hit, was treated like rubble, dragged unceremoniously, only to make way for an oncoming logistical convoy. To the Germans, this was a military heresy. A tank was a centerpiece of doctrine, a precious tactical artifact operated by experts, with careful maintenance and limited strategic use. Seeing a combat vehicle being pushed around for scrap in the middle of the battlefield represented an ideological clash, a vivid demonstration that the Allies not only had more resources, but were willing to discard them to keep the operation flowing. That excavator, anonymous, slow, unarmored, became a symbol of something much greater than its function. It was the tool of American logic, to maintain the advance, whatever the cost, replacing losses with production, not with lamentation. While the Germans counted tanks before each offensive and protected each unit as if it were irreplaceable, the Americans operated with reserves, not of courage, but of parts. There were more Shermans arriving the next day, more ammunition, more engines, more troops. War, for them, was a continuous flow, and the excavator was proof of that. This approach was the opposite of what German doctrine envisioned. Panzers, like the Tiger, the Run, or Panther, were treated as unique tactical entities. They had superior firepower, advanced armor, and a high operating cost. A Tiger could stop an entire column of Allied tanks, but it cost months to build, required specific fuel, specialized mechanics, and rare parts. When a Tiger was destroyed, the loss was not just material. It was symbolic, strategic, an irreparable scar on the front. The Shermans, on the other hand, operated under another logic. They did not win duels. They won by quantity, by presence, by constant substitution. On D+3 day, while troops were still landing in Omaha and Utah, repair centers were already being set up on the beaches. Mobile workshops with cranes, spare parts, and skilled labor were unloaded along with ammunition and food. The American war machine didn't just fight, it repaired itself as it went. A damaged tank was towed, dismantled, analyzed. If there was no time, it was abandoned, or pushed by bulldozers. The focus was not on the equipment, it was the flow. What mattered was to keep the supply line running, the battalions moving, the schedules up to date, because in that war, every hour lost cost more than an armored vehicle. This warlike pragmatism was, for the Germans, incomprehensible. Many Wehrmacht officers, when they were captured, reported the same feeling. They were not facing an army. They were facing a production conveyor belt. An officer of the 352nd Infantry Division wrote in his diary, before he was captured, "They crush us with repetition. They lose tanks and send 2. They lose soldiers and 100 more arrive. We don't face a commander. We face a number. And this number grew every day. For American commanders, losing a Sherman was no cause for commotion. It was statistics. The Lima, Ohio plant produced about 25 Shermans a day. In just 1 week, it replaced the losses of a month of combat. Parts depots in England and France itself guaranteed immediate maintenance. And when the repair wasn't worth the time, the armored vehicle was removed from the equation, replaced, as if it were a disposable link in an indestructible chain. This culture of efficiency and relentless pace shocked European military thinking, especially German. There, where every piece was the result of artisanal engineering, where every tank was calibrated like a precision watch, the idea that an armored vehicle could be discarded after a day of use was offensive. But it was exactly this mentality that defined the contrast between the two forces. The Allies had turned the war into a factory process, and in this process, what mattered was not the machine, it was the mission. This mentality was also reflected in the morale of the troops. The American soldiers knew that if their tank was hit, there would be another one waiting, that logistics would not abandon them, that technical failures would be solved with supplies, not improvisation. This created a systemic trust, a security that the system was in the service of the combatant, and that confidence was lethal, because it turned war into routine and combat into operation. There was no room for panic when the advance was predicted, fueled, and scheduled. The image of the bulldozer pushing a wrecked Sherman was not just an isolated moment. It was the portrait of a doctrine, a symbol that this war was no longer about individual bravery or genius tactics. It was about scale, of rhythm, production, and Germany, as competent as it was in its engineering, could not keep up. General Hans Speidel, then Chief of Staff of Army Group B, summed up this feeling in a melancholy phrase, said days after the landing, "We did not lose Normandy because we fought badly. We lost because they never stop." And the next day, Speidel would see another scene that would amplify this finding. A network of pipelines emerging where there was once only a beach. The fuel now came under the sea. Operation Pluto was underway, and what was once unimaginable was becoming routine. On July 25, 1944, the battlefield in Normandy ceased to be ground. It became calculus. At 9:38 a.m., the silence was broken by a sound that came not from artillery or machine guns, but from the sky. The rumble of 1,500 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers opening their cargo bays. Alongside them, 380 medium bombers and 550 fighter bombers formed a geometry of steel and smoke. It was the beginning of Operation Cobra, a low-key name for an offensive that would be remembered as the moment when ground warfare was redesigned by air engineering. The target, a 6-kilometer strip where the Wehrmacht's armored divisions were positioned. The mission, to erase this space from the map, not with an advance of troops, but with 300 tons of explosives dropped in less than 3 hours. The tactic was not just mass destruction, it was terrain modeling. The bombers flew in timed formation, following coordinate maps drawn with mathematical precision. Each attack wave was programmed to hit a quadrant with controlled overlap. The goal was not just to kill, it was to prevent movement. High explosive bombs not only destroyed structures but created craters, burned vegetation, collapsed roads. German anti-tank artillery was buried under the ground before it even had line of sight. Entire units disappeared. Some, literally. Allied reports speak of divisions reduced to radio echoes with no response. The Normandy floor turned to dry mud and twisted steel before any man set foot there. The Wehrmacht was conceived as a maneuvering force. His generals believed in the elasticity of the line, in the counteroffensive, in the tactical use of the terrain. But there was no counteroffensive possible against an enemy that disfigured the terrain before occupying. When American soldiers advanced after the bombing, they encountered no organized resistance, they found craters. The German front line had dissolved, literally, and for the first time since the beginning of the war, an American unit broke through the front with greater speed and depth than any blitzkrieg. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The Reich, which has invested so much in weapons of terror, V-rockets, super cannons, super heavy tanks, has ignored the basic principle of modern warfare. Control of the air is no longer support. It is decision. And Operation Cobra proved this with numbers. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts accurately, like and subscribe. This helps us continue to bring you detailed, technical, and in-depth historical content that these moments deserve. For the German soldiers who survived the bombing, the feeling was not one of defeat. It was one of displacement. Many reported disorientation, hearing loss, emotional breakdown. One general, Fritz Bayerlein, commander of Panzer Lehr, declared after the attack, "I had no army left. There were men buried and machines burned. The war is over for us in that camp." The statement was not poetic. It was literal. Panzer Lehr, considered one of Germany's elite armored divisions, lost 70% of its combat capability in a single day. The technology used by the Allies to guide the bombers included smoke markers, radio coordinates, and forward observers that signaled the exact moment of attack. Each element was synchronized. There was no improvisation. It was an aerial operation with production line precision. And that was the point. War had become an industry in the sky. While the Germans still operated with paper maps and trench binoculars, the Allies used real-time communication to redraw the battlefield from a distance. The philosophical difference was striking. Germany was trying to win with tactical power, moving troops, redrawing positions, preparing ambushes. The United States won with operational architecture, shaping the environment, isolating resistance, anticipating reactions. Operation Cobra was the pinnacle of this model, and it proved that in that war, ground combat was only the second act. The first came from the sky, in blocks of tons, timed with industrial precision. The engineers behind the operation studied winds, altitudes, payload, detonation time. The bombs did not fall. They were applied. And the results were not just destruction but modeling the advance. Each explosion created a void, and in this void, the American infantry entered with logistics ready. Tanks, radios, food. The German line did not retreat, it evaporated, and the most impactful thing was not the strength, it was repeatability. Operation Cobra was just one of many. The same model would be applied in Saint-Lô, in Brest, in Caen. The mathematics of destruction has become a spreadsheet. Each zone was drawn, each load calculated. The war now responded to timelines, and whoever commanded the stopwatch dominated the field. The next morning, the American 3rd Armored Division advanced 30 kilometers in a single day, without finding a cohesive line of defense. What was left of the German regiments was disoriented, fragmented, seeking refuge in ruined villages. And in that chaos, another piece of the Allied gear would be revealed: the distribution of fuel through submarine pipelines. Operation Pluto was activated, and what was to come now was not just advancement, it was the permanent installation of mobile warfare. The industry would now supply power directly from English soil to the tanks in France. Logistics gained a new rhythm, and the Germans once again would see that the enemy was not fighting, he was building victory. In August 1944, the Allied offensive reached its culmination in a narrow valley, surrounded by hills and cut by hardened dirt roads. His name was Falaise. For the Germans, it has become synonymous with logistical desperation. For the Allies, it was the funeral of the Nazi war machine in Normandy. The Wehrmacht, in a desperate attempt to retreat east and reorganize its forces, found itself caught in a coordinated pincer movement between the British, Canadians, Poles, and Americans. What formed there was not a traditional battlefield but a corridor of annihilation, where Allied artillery, precision bombers, and ground superiority collapsed any and all attempts at escape. More than 10,000 German soldiers were killed in less than 72 hours. About 40,000 were captured. The rest fled on foot, leaving behind not only corpses, but the material structure of the Wehrmacht itself. The numbers speak for themselves. 344 German tanks destroyed, 2,000 vehicles abandoned, hundreds of artillery pieces left in the ditches. Trucks were set on fire so as not to fall into enemy hands. Radios were crushed with rifle butts. Officers tore up maps with their teeth. The final image of the German army in Normandy was that of a force that not only lost, it was disintegrated. Their divisions did not retreat with strategy. They evaporated in silence, with soldiers scattered, hungry, disconnected from any command. There was no lack of courage. There was a lack of structure. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, the scene was almost surreal. In the same valley where the Germans burned tanks for lack of fuel, the Americans set up temporary spare parts depots. Mobile hospitals operated with steam sterilization, electric generators, and plasma stockpiles. Itinerant workshops welded plates on jeeps and tanks in the field itself, as if the advance had not stopped. Allied forces, supplied by regular convoys from artificial ports, operated with the fluidity of a corporate supply chain. The war had become an extension of the logistical system, and the Allies had bridged the gap between rear and front line. The collapse at Falaise was not just military. It was symbolic. The last mobility reserves of the Third Reich in France had been consumed, not by pitched battles, but by a series of wrong decisions in the face of an enemy that did not retreat, did not exhaust, and did not improvise, only executed with mechanical precision. The Luftwaffe did not appear. German artillery failed for lack of ammunition. The radios were muted. Tanks with combat potential were stopped by mechanical failures. No grease, no drivers, no command. Falaise was the burial of a doctrine. The belief that tactical elite, localized firepower, and discipline could vanquish an enemy operating as an industry fell apart, literally, and that humiliation was recorded by reconnaissance pilots who flew over the so-called death row, a 15-kilometer trail covered with vehicle carcasses human remains and black smoke. The soil there was no longer soil. It was military rubble. German General Paul Hauser, trying to escape the encirclement with his remaining troops, recorded, "Our men are slipping away, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion, not for lack of faith, but for lack of means. The enemy did not overcome us with strategy. He choked us with rhythm." The statement, made in a resigned tone, was more than an outburst. It was confirmation that the war had changed its nature. And Germany, which had started the conflict with revolutionary weapons, now found itself trapped in a scrap metal trench. Behind the scenes, Allied officers visited the Falaise camps with maps and lists. They catalogued vehicles, collected captured armaments, estimated enemy losses with statistical accuracy. It was another step in war accounting, the American effort to not only win, but record, measure, and learn from each advance. War was also a laboratory, and Falaise was his most didactic experiment. He demonstrated what happens when the doctrine of improvisation faces systematic engineering. On the German evacuation line, a Panther tank lies destroyed for lack of fuel. Its commander, before abandoning him, scrawled on the inner plates a short phrase intended for no one: "Kein Tropfen," not a drop. This absence of fuel, as simple as it is devastating, represents the entire breakdown of the German war machine. When tanks don't move, doctrines don't survive. And what were Americans doing at that very moment? Installation of mobile telephone lines, distribution of supplies with forklifts, sending new maps to battalions with terrain updates generated by reconnaissance planes. Nothing there was improvised. Everything was planned, delivered, monitored. The battlefield had become a living spreadsheet, and war, a large-scale logistical operation. Falaise closes Normandy, not with a planted flag, but with the image of an army that melted due to structural starvation. The German command did not expect the defeat to come from mathematics, but that is exactly what happened. Each tank lost was more than a vehicle. It was one less link in the chain. And on the other side, the Allies manufactured chains by the ton. Colonel Heinz Günther Guderian, son of the legendary armored strategist, wrote in his personal notes, "We were taught that we would win with maneuver, but they beat us with numbers, and every number of them came with oil, steel, and food." The war was in fact lost, but there was still one last German illusion, that they could reorganize their forces on national territory. What they didn't know was that the enemy factory was already advancing faster than their legs, and in the coming weeks, a new front line would emerge, not in the fields, but on the roads, where American trains would make history. After the surrender, when the uniforms were collected, the guns silenced, and the smoke from the cities dissipated, the memories remained, and with them, the confessions. What senior German officials wrote, said, or blurted out in post-war interrogations revealed more than military plans. It revealed the inner collapse of a belief. Among the accounts, few have been as frank as that of General Günther Blumentritt, a veteran strategist of the French campaign and the defense of Normandy. In a memo recorded in 1946, he stated with surgical precision, "We lost the war because we were fighting against a nation that could replace everything but time. It wasn't the courage of the American soldier, or even the genius of his generals. It was the permanence of production lines day and night, ignoring bombing, overcoming shortages, adapting methods, delivering results." Rommel, the Desert Fox, was even more direct in his private remarks before his forced death. In conversations with close officers, recorded in letters and diaries, he acknowledged, "The American divisions did not advance for courage. They advanced by organization. Each platoon we faced carried behind it a rear guard of industrial proportions." Rommel understood early on that the Battle of Normandy was only the final symptom of a terminal illness in the German logistical system, a disease that began with arrogance and ended with shortages. Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, when questioned by the British about the mistakes of the High Command, merely shook his head and said in a low voice, "Our mistake was to fight a 19th century war against a 20th century enemy." The phrase, although melancholic, is precise. Germany built its war machine on the glory of quick campaigns, the skill of its troops, localized technical superiority. But the United States did not play that game. They created another one, a game where production was worth more than tactics, where time was optimized by metrics, where each grenade thrown on French soil had passed through an assembly line, quality control, packaging, shipment, and tracking. Hans Speidel, one of the brains of Army Group B, wrote in his memoirs a confession that breaks the veneer of Nazi doctrine. "We were not defeated by better soldiers. We were crushed by factories." The phrase ran behind the scenes of historians like an epitaph of the Third Reich, a definitive statement of what many already knew, but few had clearly said. War was no longer decided on the battlefields. It was decided in the 8-hour shifts of the Detroit factories, in the supply reports of the American Army, in the convoys of trucks that crossed Europe more regularly than any German train. And this reality was not visible on the maps. In the planning rooms of the Wehrmacht, German generals saw lines, arrows, and symbols. What they did not see, and therefore never understood, was what these lines represented: an avalanche of resources. While General Model requested reinforcements that never arrived, the Americans sent divisions complete with manuals, spare parts, and vacuum-packed ration. The irony of this war was that tactical superiority, celebrated in the halls of the Reich, became irrelevant in the face of the strength of continuous resupply. And it wasn't just about volume, it was about mentality. The American war was managed as a project. Production goals, integration between companies, innovation applied at scale. Ford's Willow Run plant produced a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Each of them was a message, and that message wasn't one of intimidation, it was one of inevitability. For every Tiger armor destroyed, dozens of Shermans appeared. For each railway line sabotaged, a new route was created with trucks. During trials and interviews, many officers tried to justify their decisions. They spoke of intelligence failures, of Allied deceptions, of command difficulties. But at some point, most would stop and admit there was nothing to be done. The American machine was bigger, faster, more adaptable. She didn't have to be perfect. It needed to be enough. And she was more than that. She was constant. Perhaps the most emblematic of the testimonies was that of Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments. In his book he wrote, "I knew the war was lost when I saw the numbers. Even with all the rationalization, even with all the use of prisoners, we could never match it. The Allies' output was so vast that they could afford to make mistakes and still win." When the Minister of Production admits that the very logic of war is outdated, there is nothing left to hide. This part of the story, although less told, is perhaps the most important, because it dismantles the myth that wars are won only by bravery or strategy. World War II showed that bravery without replacement turns into silence, that the strategy without fuel is just a dead plan, and that an army, no matter how trained, does not cross a continent without tires, without food, without radio, and without maintenance. If this reality impresses you, comment below. Shocking data. Because it was exactly this data that the Nazi generals themselves did not want to see. The truth has always been in the spreadsheets. And while propaganda cried out for heroism, American production reports drew the inevitable outcome. But there is one last point on this journey: the way in which the Allies themselves transformed this industrial logic into military doctrine. The next step was not just to win the war, it was to institutionalize victory, transform that temporary gear into a permanent force. And that's precisely where the final difference lies. The war is over, but the structure remains. In the next few minutes, we will understand how the United States not only defeated the Third Reich, but founded a new era of domination based on production, transportation, and absolute control of the backstage of the war. D-Day did not end on June 6, 1944. He has only just begun. What followed that morning was more than a successful military campaign. It was the foundation of a new strategic paradigm, where combat ceased to be an art of maneuvering and became a science of supply. What was once solved at the point of the bayonet now depended on a convoy of trucks. The Allied victory in Normandy did not only prove the momentary superiority of the United States over the Axis, it proved that the future of the war would belong to those who dominated the rear: the fuel, the food, the radios, the maintenance. For the first time in modern military history, winning meant keeping the machine running longer than the enemy. This change was not restricted to the American military academies. In Moscow, London, Paris, and even Berlin, analysts and generals redesigned their resumes. Tactical maneuvers began to be preceded by logistical studies. Air supremacy is no longer a support and has become a precondition. Infantry became dependent on engineering. War ceased to be a duel between generals and became a collective effort between factories, administrators, and engineers. Operation Overlord taught that you don't take territory, you sustain territory. And that requires something that tanks and rifles don't offer: mass coordination. The difference between failure and success came to be measured in hours of refueling, tons of ammunition delivered, liters of fuel stockpiled. The battle had been won days before, in the holds of cargo ships, in the distribution spreadsheets, in the warehouses set up miles from the front line. Interestingly, the impact of this new military doctrine was so profound that it reached even the vanquished. Many of the captured German officers, after years of seclusion and reflection, became advocates of an idea that would have sounded absurd in 1939: the economic integration of Europe. Seeing how the United States had shaped a victory based on unification of resources, standardization of industry, and cross-sectoral cooperation, they realized that the only way for Europe not to be eternally outdated was to operate as a bloc. The war destroyed Nazi Germany, but it sowed the seeds of modern Germany: industrial, democratic, cooperative. And that wasn't an accident. It was a direct effect of the logistical doctrine. The Marshall Plan, devised shortly after the war, was the peaceful version of the same principle: winning by supply. But now, instead of ammunition, capital was sent. Instead of tanks, tractors were sent. The same country that had crushed the Reich with tanks and bombers was now rebuilding Europe with cement and credit. The logic of total production had won out and had become the norm. In the following decades, each conflict began to be preceded by analyses that were previously neglected. In Vietnam, in the Gulf, in Afghanistan, military success was conditional on the supply chain, the dominance of airspace, the ability to keep the flow going. Military power is no longer symbolized by a sword. It came to be symbolized by a container, and the reflection of this transformation can be seen to this day. Logistics satellites monitor troops in real time. Algorithms predict ammunition consumption. Combat is preceded by engineering and mapping operations. What D-Day has shown in a cruel and definitive way is that ideologies, brilliant tactics, or isolated bravery can do nothing against a well-oiled gear. Modern war is not won by force, but by the continuity of force. And perhaps the most ironic thing is that, among those who understood this most quickly, were the defeated themselves. In Speidel's notes there is a short sentence, almost hidden among reports: "They did not come to take, they came to sustain it." This phrase, written by one of the brains of the German army, sums up the shock of those who saw the war change before their eyes. This change was not only military, it was civilizational. The victory in 1944 didn't just redraw maps, it redesigned the way the West began to think about conflict, industry, alliances, and planning. Every NATO alliance, every interconnected supply system, every combined task force across sea, air, and land carries the invisible heritage of D-Day. The certainty that organization trumps brutality, and that industry, when managed well, can be more lethal than any armored division. But one last image remains, a vision that, decades later, still sums up the essence of that day. They are not tanks, nor soldiers. It is a man, alone, looking through binoculars, at the top of a coastal battery. The sea he knew disappeared. In its place was a continuous line of steel, smoke, and ships. At that moment, without firing a single shot, he understood what many generals still refuse to admit. In the final chapter of this documentary, we will return to that moment, but with new eyes. Because now, with all the data revealed, with all the strategies exposed, it will be possible to understand what that officer saw, and why, in seeing the impossible, he also saw the inevitable. 40 years later, Zuri Walter Olmsen returned to the same observation point off the coast of Normandy. The cracked concrete of the old Chris battery still resisted the wind of the now silent canal. As he looked out to sea, he saw no enemies, no ghosts. He saw the memory of a shock. Because on that morning of June 6, 1944, he didn't just witness an armada. He saw before his own eyes the implosion of a belief. The myth of tactical superiority, of pure bravery, of technique without an industrial base. All this collapsed in the face of the coldest and most implacable force of all, organized production. The Third Reich was not defeated by better soldiers, but by a civilization that had understood the true battlefield. The industry, logistics, continuity. And that's what makes D-Day more than a military operation. It was the final exposition of a new doctrine of power. Modern warfare belongs not to the bravest nor to the swiftest, but to the most prepared. Victory belongs to those who deliver more, sustain more, coordinate better. It wasn't the bullet that won. It was the gear. It wasn't the maneuver. It was the treadmill. The lesson is brutal and eternal. Strategy without supply is just desire. Morality without maintenance is just speech. No plane survives the lack of fuel. General Alfred Jodl himself, who would sign Germany's surrender in 1945, would admit, "We lost to an assembly line." This short and devastating sentence sums up not only the end of the Reich, but the birth of a new era, the era where tanks are pushed by bulldozers because there are others ready in the warehouse, the era where airplanes eliminate entire divisions with maps and calculations, the era where winning is not an act of bravery, but of moral organization. If you value this search for real facts and analysis that goes beyond the obvious, like this video and subscribe to the channel. This helps our research work stay alive, so stories like this are never forgotten or simplified. Leave in the comments which data surprised you the most: the 14,000 planes, the 7,000 ships, or the tanks pushed as logistical rubble. Ring the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact, because history still has a lot to reveal. And don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen, because as we saw today, it's not the bullet that defines victory, it's the bridge that delivers it. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.